Welcome to Ancestral Health Today, evolutionary insights into modern health.
Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of the Ancestral Health Today podcast. And today we have with us Richelle Sepulveda. Thank you, Richelle, for being here and welcome to the podcast.
Hi. Well, thank you, Isabel, for welcoming me in. So just a little bit about myself. My name is Richelle Sepulveda. I've been teaching psychology for almost 12 years now, thinking about the number of it. And I'm also a person with chronic health issues that I have been addressing with a variety of means, including diet changes, like the keto diet.
Wonderful. So tell us a little bit about what got you interested in the keto diet.
Well, as my health issues had continued, I knew it was some aspect of energy production issues, given also my science background and things too. So I was kind of trying to figure out what would be a best way to address it. I wanted to try something with diet rather than any other intervention to start off with. And so I've always been somebody who's not gravitated towards anything that would count into a fad diet. So it was like, what foods would actually help with mitochondrial respiration and help with that? And I looked at it, and the first thing I saw was keto. And I was like, oh, keto, because it's always had such a aura about it, about how it had a tendency to be picked up by certain groups that were very, very passionate about it, but were not always ones in which I followed the trends that they would do. But so I looked into it. I wanted to find out more about it. And it did significantly help me I figured I'd give myself a month and see how I would do on it. And within a week, I saw significant improvements for myself. And that's been up and down over the years since then. But it was just been a really interesting change on how much just that particular diet intervention helped. And plus also, it really spurred me into looking into what is a little bit of the science behind it and why that diet might help. And it also, it helps other things besides just the energy production that you might think of. There's some other things that could also be relevant when you're moving into a more restrictive diet, like the ketogenic diet.
So what are some of the science findings that you came across when you were researching?
So some of the science findings, well, first to look at what was trying to find out what exactly does keto do when it comes to how you would actually produce energy from it and how that would be different than more of a glucose-based diet or carbohydrate-based diet and why it was such a significant difference. And one of the first things I ran across was this website that was called the Charlie Foundation. And it was in regards to like reduplicating some of the efforts of the early uses of the ketogenic diet were actually developed in the 1920s for treating children with epilepsy. And the energy production from the ketones themselves was much higher, more ATP produced than compared to, say, glucose. And that helped with seizures and with epilepsy. And that was kind of started me looking into that process, wondering about how much of, say, my cognitive issues and other like physical slowing was due to just not being able to produce energy from more of the glucose carb-based diet. And so, yeah, the ketogenic diet actually has a long science history with it. It was kind of just rejuvenated in the late 80s, early 90s, and in response to somebody trying to find treatment for his child with medication-resistant epilepsy. And he found how much keto helped, and he wanted to spread the word, and he created this nonprofit in the name of the son, so the Charlie Foundation, to help people as much as possible to get the word out that this is a useful diet. Now, a lot of people have heard of the Atkins diet, which does have some aspect of ketogenic process in it, but just trying to get into the science of it, again, it has to do with being able to produce higher volume of energy, like the transfer, I'm trying to remember the exact ratio, but it's a significantly higher number of ATP produced for the mitochondria from ketones versus glucose. And so with that, even if you're not able to use the energy efficiently, if you are producing more possible ATP, that gives you more possible energy to tap into, which is one reason why it can help so much with chronic health issues, because you can have some of this extra energy that's a little bit more of a surplus compared to more on a carb-based direction. So, there's a lot of really fun things when you get into it, but then there's also like breakdowns in the system that even there's at different times with different types of viral infection, you can actually shut down the ability to generate ketones in your liver. And exogenous ketones are about the only way then at that point to be able to maintain the ketogenic state.
So what were some of the changes that you saw in your own health, and how has that varied throughout the years?
So originally, to start off with, I went from being very lethargic, low energy, lower mood, slower cognitive process. I went from that particular state to within a week, I was, because I was a bit worried to start off with, because with the lower energy production that I had, I wasn't able to do like meal prep and that. So I knew that would be a concern to start off with, because a lot of the issue with the keto diet, in order to make sure you maintain the appropriate nutrient balance, you don't do this thing that's called dirty keto. And dirty keto is kind of moving towards the easy to get keto foods, which are not necessarily always going to be otherwise as close to the whole source as possible. So, more like things like cured meats and various things, more saturated fat and that. And it's easier, but it doesn't necessarily give you all the same benefits, because you do need to make sure you're still getting a wide variety of nutrients, which is harder to do. And I was concerned about that myself to start off with, because being able to do food prep had been something that I was been struggling with my lower energy. And so in that first week, I was wondering how I was going to do this. I'd kind of tried to plan out a few foods, so that way I could, even if I was eating the same food every day, at least be something I could continuously use. But by the end of that first week, I was making whole meals because I had the time and the energy and the extra to spare to plan meals, to prep foods, to create something more elaborate. I started making desserts again that I could have. It was just a switch right away. And in doing that, I actually ended up having more variety in my diet, because before that, I was in such a low energy state. There wasn't a lot of variety in my foods, because I was going for something that I could have just in that moment because I was too tired to prep. So that was a significant difference. But then also another big difference with it is I also have MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome, which I'd had known about it some at the time, and I thought I had it controlled to an extent. But then when I went into the much more restrictive diet of the ketogenic diet, I discovered that there was a lot of foods that I didn't realize I was reacting to until they were no longer part of my diet. And with that, I ended up with a big improvement on aspects of my gut health, things moving a lot more efficiently without, in a more appropriate manner. My skin cleared up. Again, my cognitive function greatly improved. Actually, anxiety and depression dropped dramatically at that point. I was actually able to sleep through the night. And I I had more energy to do just about everything. I could, just handle like just day-to-day life without near as much fatigue at the end. And I could sleep in a more nice solid night of sleep, which if you've dealt with chronic illness at all, that's almost one of the constant problems, is that not being able to sleep well, which is one of those, it's one of those amazing things to finally be able to just sleep and wake up feeling rested. That was just probably one of the biggest moments, is to be able to wake up in the morning feeling refreshed, which I hadn't had that for years. So that was like an amazing feeling for it.
So how long ago was this? How long ago did you start the ketogenic diet?
So I started a little over 4 years ago, right about 4 years ago, approximately, a little right around that. So I'd been doing that for quite some time. I haven't been perfectly within keto that entire time. I've gone in and out of it. That first year I was pretty strict. And then the second year, I went ahead and was trying to reintroduce different types of carbs or more starchy foods than I'd had in the past. With limited success here and there. And then anytime I'd feel like a downturn in energy in that, I would cut those back out and then kind of, go back harder into keto. And then 2 years ago, I ended up getting sick again. And due to I had another COVID infection. And I ended up, after that, I started struggling to initiate ketogenesis again. And I couldn't develop ketones unless I had something exogenous. Wasn't actually able to access any of my own body stores. I guess that's one thing I hadn't mentioned already, that when I first started the keto diet, I actually started to drop weight. First it was water weight, and then I ended up reducing excess weight. But after I had that second infection, I ended up increasing weight again, and I just could not generate ketones. I mean, the numbers before had been great. I'd had an easy time with it. And after that, I just struggled to be able to do it at all. And then that's when I found a few different possible reasons for that. Some of it had to do with some other medications I was taking may have interfered. But then also a big part of it had to do with the fact that some viral infections and COVID's notorious for this, is to actually interfere with your ability to generate ketones in the liver. So after I could do like a 48-hour full water fast, and I could start to get myself back into ketogenesis. But if I ended up breaking that at all and having anything that would knock me out, I would be struggling to generate ketones again, no matter how restrictive my diet was, unless I did a fast again. So that's become actually a lot more difficult to maintain ketogenesis since then, to stay in that state, just because of the difficulties post-infection. So I can still do it. And even if I'm not staying in full ketosis, I'm still benefiting. I could see a difference compared to if I've taken in more carbs, just staying in the lower carb range. Even if I'm not generating ketones, I'm still seeing benefit. But it's not quite the same energy bump that I had in the past. But that's been fluctuating at various times when aspects of my health have improved. Keto then comes right back, and I'm making like full amounts of ketones again, which is great. And I have all this extra energy. And so it's now part of like a way I can measure where my health is doing based on the number of ketones I'm able to generate.
That's fascinating. Now, do you use it cyclically, or do you go to it as a rescue, or do you go into it, when you're feeling better and you know that you'll be able to generate those ketones?
In general, I'm not really rigid on just watching every portion and watching everything. In general, I've tried to plan most everything as trying to stay in keto, but with some aspects of just, letting a few things slide here and there, and I had a cookie, kind of thing. And then if I do catch myself in a bit of a health downturn, I kind of crank it back down and make sure that I'm not cheating. But in general, I try to stay in that direction for the most part. So it's kind of, it's mostly then if I've had like success of like a week or two of definitely feeling that slowdown again, I will just make sure that I might do a fast, and then make sure I'm staying rigidly adhering to more of what I need to for keto, and making sure my fat intake is high enough, because that's usually actually one of my markers that I'm not doing as well if I'm not generating enough, is I'm not ingesting enough fat, which if you've never tried a keto diet and then you decide to do it, that's one of those things you don't realize how much fat you actually have to take in. And some of the benefit, the things you can take in order to help with that, like coconut or coconut oil or MCT oil, it's based in coconut. That's one of those foods that I can't have due to my MCAS. And so that takes that as it's not fair. Coconut's delicious and I can't have it. But it is definitely something that can help a lot of people. The coconut oil can help, because it's one of the easiest ones to generate some of those exogenous ketones a little bit, or it's a quick way to do it. But I can't do that. So I have to just really watch, like, just everything else is just huge amounts of fat. I've actually taken like little shot glasses and filled them up with oil sometimes and just knocked that back. Because that's about the only way to get to the volume that I would need. Because a lot of times when my health it goes in a downturn, I also lose a lot of appetite. And so it's really hard to actually make myself eat enough, especially with enough fat in it. And so I'll be like, you know what? I'm just going to take a shot of oil, some olive oil. Here we go. This will help at least some. So that can help. But it's
and olive oil is delicious in a shot. If anybody hasn't tried it, that's definitely one thing. But it has to be good olive oil, because, you can definitely taste the difference for sure. Yeah.
Did you know olive oil is absolutely delicious on ice cream?
No, but I've had it in coffee. So I can only imagine that it is delicious in ice cream.
You just drizzle it over the top, and it makes this nice little, like, almost like a candy-ish kind of like crust on it. It's pretty good.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I will have to try it for sure. So there's a lot of emergent information in regards to keto diets for mental health. And you mentioned that one of the benefits that you saw in the beginning was a decrease in depression and anxiety. So what are your thoughts on this research, and where do you think that's leading us?
So I think part of where that might be, part of the benefit I had with that had to do not necessarily just with the keto, but also being able to restrict the foods that I didn't realize I was having reactions to. And those were also then contributing to the anxiety and depression symptoms. But also, like depression especially is kind of correlated with aspects of neural inflammation. And not having enough energy to kind of block it, but due to just the immune system being able to be activated properly, or hypometabolism in areas of the brain, it helps quite a bit to have just extra ketones or extra energy available, and that can help kind of like bump out of that to an extent. That requires to actually have being able to, you're constantly having to suppress those thoughts. You don't realize how much you're suppressing negative and unpleasant thoughts all the time. Until you're in a lower energy state, and then those start to pop up regularly. And that's one of those, when you have more energy to filter those out, you'll catch your mood just does a significant improvement. So that's part of it. Part of it is, again, the huge amount. I almost think that almost any type of restrictive diet, at least temporarily, that's where I think a lot of people, when they're on different fad diets that really restrict a whole group of foods and they do amazing on it, I really think a lot of those times it has to do with the particular foods the person was eating may have been something that they were reacting to, be it the MCAS or causing other aspects of inflammation, say in the gut or however, and that is actually contributing to aspects of mental illness. But as far as like keto, just having the extra energy available makes a huge difference. We do know it helps with epilepsy. There's actually quite a bit of research out there with it on epilepsy. But that also then overlaps a lot with other like neurodivergent conditions, so including things like ADHD, autism, in that a lot of those have to do with the ability to have the energy to control your the sensitivities that you're experiencing with the world, because people who are neurodivergent just have more of this coming at them, and so you need to have more energy in order to be able to filter these out. And so a ketogenic diet can help quite a bit with that. Plus, with things like autism, there's actually a lot of overlap with epilepsy and seizure disorders with autism as well. I've seen some research a bit on things like bipolar disorder can also do fairly well on with aspects of a keto diet, but it's not perfect for everybody. There's going to be some people in which it's just not going to work as well, but a huge part of it is just making sure there's a full amount of energy to the variety of areas of the brain that are just needing this extra bit, that you don't realize how much some areas of your brain have kind of gone into a power saving mode just because there's other critical systems that need it first. And so when you have the extra energy, it can help with so many aspects of cognition and focus, which again can help with anxiety, depression, but it can also help with just being able to manage daily tasks and plan out what you need to do, which then helps lower your overall stress load because you have these things anticipated. So there's a lot of benefits with it that may be like secondary and may not be the keto itself, but the resulting effects downstream from it. So it's hard to necessarily always pinpoint it, but there's again, works for a lot of people, but not everybody. So.
Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit more onto that brain energy? Because I can picture maybe some people with ADHD in particularly, right? Where ADHD in particular, where people are perceived as being in a hyper energetic state, right? To the fidgeting, the needing to move a lot, and so forth and so on. So to some people, it might sound like, oh, I don't have an energy deficiency. I have too much energy. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So the first thing I would use on that one is an example on where you might see that. The easiest one to see it is on toddlers. So when you've got a tired toddler, they start bouncing off the walls because they don't have the energy to settle down, focus, and do what they need to, because it requires, again, a lot of this brain control. It's kind of like, I would say, as far as the energy that you're using, say like an ADHD where you need this extra energy, it'd be similar to being, say, in a meeting and your boss has got some sort of idea or says something, and say you think of this really inappropriate joke that would go along with it that should not be used in this boardroom, and you just have to bite your tongue with it. That requires a huge amount of energy to do that. And if you don't have enough energy on it, you might end up, especially if you have something like ADHD, it comes out. You're constantly holding back a huge amount in order to socialize with people, be able to focus in the world. Actually, a huge amount of our personalities are based on what we restrain, not what we produce. Because you also have to consider things about like how your words are going to be impacting people. That requires this thought process where you've got to think it out, how the consequences of it, and then plan on how to maybe adjust your wording to adjust the consequences. And that all is a path that each one of those places requires energy to hold back. And if you are lower on energy, then you may just break right through those and just blurt out whatever it is, and then tell somebody that, yeah, you do look horrible in that dress. And when they'd be just like, oh my God, why would you say it that way? And you're like, I am so sorry. I didn't mean it that way. But if you have you might notice this when you're sick and you have it's kind of, if you've ever seen nurses talk about the person that is the one that you have to worry about the most, is that nice little old grandma that's super sweet to everybody. And then when she's a little bit frustrated or in pain, that kind of thing, and the nurses are the only ones there with her, then she lets it out. She's the one that's going to hit them, kind of thing, because she's restraining it constantly because that's who she is. And then when you're sick, you just don't have the energy for that. And that's again, when we're talking about something like with ADHD, you're constantly having to have an extra effort to hold these things back because it is not as intuitive or instinctual as it is for somebody who isn't neurodivergent. And so somebody else may be able to just be like, oh, I wouldn't do that. I'd be able to stop myself. No problem. That's easy. I don't even have to think about it. With somebody with ADHD, they have to think about it constantly. Just to keep themselves from, say, twitching or moving weird in front of somebody, that they have to be thinking about the impact of that movement on the person in front of them, which then changes, again, all this extra effort that they're doing. And just having a little bit of extra energy can go a long way, which is one reason why most ADHD medications are some version of a stimulant, because they do actually help wake up more or less that part of the brain. I've kind of used this in an instruction thing in the past about how, just imagine you have a club, you know, a bar or club, that kind of thing, and there's a bouncer at the door, and he's supposed to be watching who's coming into the club to make sure you stay under the fire limits, to make sure you have a right ratio to people, or this person looks like they may be like prone to fights, kind of keeping track of all that kind of thing inside the club. Well, what if that bouncer falls asleep and everybody just comes in? Then it gets all chaos in there. Then there's a fire and there's an emergency and there's a run on the bar and then people are in fights and all that. And so the stimulant medication for ADHD is like giving that bouncer a cup of coffee. It doesn't replace him being well rested, but it gets you there to cross that line to be able to do what you need to do. And it's kind of similar when being able to produce enough energy from ketogenesis. This is just be able to have just a little bit of extra energy in order to be able to help with all of these actually cognitively heavy energy tasks. Because your brain uses a lot of energy. A huge chunk of the energy you consume every day goes to fueling your brain. And if you're a little bit short on that, then your brain's going to do the base survival systems, and it's kind of just hopes that you don't go too far in the other direction and don't crash, or don't say something you're going to regret dramatically later. But that's not a good way to run every day if you can avoid it. So if you can have some extra energy, that helps a lot.
Do you think there are people where the ketogenic diet is not advisable, or potential for, not just not deriving the benefit, but actually being detrimental?
Yes, there is actually a huge chunk of people that it just doesn't work as well for first. If you have any tendency towards an eating disorder, if you run eating disorders in your family, the whole process of ketogenesis, where you have to stay within a perfect amount of fat to carbs ratio, make sure you have the right protein, so keeping these numbers perfect, and then also trying to stay in ketogenesis, because if you get knocked out of it, then it stops having the benefits. That can really trigger a lot of the perfection issues that come with an eating disorder. So if you have OCD or anxiety in your family, it ends up being one of those things you want to be very careful about. Or if you've had any history of an eating disorder, this can really at times trigger an eating disorder in people who didn't necessarily notice they've had it before. So if you catch yourself in these over-regimented style eating pathways, this may not be a good one for you, because that can get into a whole host of unhealthy directions. Also, people with type 1 diabetes, it's usually not recommended for. That doesn't mean that they can't, but they have to be very, very careful, because in diabetes, if you are type 1 or type 2, you can get into this thing called ketoacidosis, where you're actually you're not using glucose and your body's just using ketones, but it does it in such a huge amount that you actually develop more it gets very damaging. You generate way too many ketones for what you would need, and you have a high level of glucose at the same time. And that can be that's actually one of the leading causes of the deaths of type 1 diabetes in history, before we had insulin replacement. So would be moving into that. So that's definitely something to watch for. If you do have diabetes, it's one of those things you wouldn't want to keep the secret from your doctor in the slightest. You'd want to make sure they were a partner with you on it, because it is such a critical thing to watch for. Both with type 1 and type 2 diabetes have that risk for it. It's much higher risk with type 1, but type 2 diabetes can have that as well. There's also a couple other health disorders in which if you do have a tendency towards gallstones, the higher fat content with the keto diet, especially if it does start triggering a larger volume of weight loss, can trigger aspects of gallstone issues. Plus, also depending on how you do on the different types of fats, if you've had your gallbladder removed, you can do the keto diet, but especially if it's been recent, it becomes more difficult because you may not be producing enough bile acid to really be able to digest the fats properly, and you could have a significant gastric upset and not with it. So that's something, again, you just really would want to be working with your doctor. You wouldn't want to be starting a diet like the keto diet without some sort of coordination with some sort of medical practitioner, especially if you have any chronic health issues, because you may not realize how this may impact some aspects of it. Plus, there is a big issue with aspects of malnutrition if you're not eating a variety of vegetables with it. A lot of people, they're used to eating vegetables that are also tied with a very starchy content. And so that's where they get a lot of that kind of like plant-based foods. And so if they're on keto, they may not be actually eating enough green vegetables or having enough full vitamin content and that's not healthy either. So it's also, so there's just lots of ways it can go wrong. Also, there's some people that really struggle to initiate the ketogenesis and may be stuck in this first phase. It's called keto flu by a lot of people, where your body's trying to transition from being powered mostly by ketones to from going from more of a carb glucose based powering to more of a keto based. And in that time period, there's also often can be a significant mood and health downturn. Usually it lasts a week or two. I've heard some people say it could last a month. Depends on the person. But that also comes up with one of those things. Is that really going to be the best diet for you? If every time you've got to get back into keto, it takes you a month to basically recover, that ends up being one of those. Is this going to be a good option for you long term? So it's basically, I kind of go with the idea, if food makes you miserable, or the particular type of food, that's not a good one for you. So this may not be a good diet for you if you end up being feeling worse than you did before. Maybe you can also transition and do a few other things in the meantime to kind of buffer that. Like I mentioned, the coconut oil. There's actually taking MCT oil or just coconut oil can actually give you a lot of the effect of generating these exogenous ketones without necessarily doing the fully restrictive diet. Other people do aspects of intermittent fasting to get some of the same benefits, because a lot of what keto is doing is mimicking some aspects of the fasted state. So if you can actually get some of that benefit just from fasting in general. That's why I would do a fast to kind of kick myself back in. a water fast, because it would actually that's part of what you do in order to initiate what keto's there for, is to tap into your fat stores. That's why we put it on.
Any differences between men and women?
I would say not a significant gender difference on that. When I've heard of people with keto flu, just anecdotally, the people I've heard that had more of an issue with that were more men than women. But there's also going to be aspects of that that's also tied to lipolysis, so being able to access your own fat stores. And sometimes women can have more issues with that, so they may need to have more exogenous ketones, at least to start off with. So it's kind of mixed on it. It kind of also depends on your energy needs throughout the day as well. It's kind of, like I said, I haven't seen any really big gender differences on it, but there are some. I mean, it's just it's more of like an individual health needs rather than, I think, really more of a gendered one.
Okay. So if a person wants to get started on the ketogenic diet and see if this is something that would be of benefit to them based on whatever their goals are, what would you recommend they would do? And if you can have recommendations for the different populations, so a person who is, otherwise healthy and a person who is dealing with chronic conditions, would you advise them differently?
So, well, when it comes to somebody who is otherwise assumes that they're healthy, a lot of us don't realize how maybe unhealthy we actually are. We think, oh yeah, I'm perfectly good. I just have to do this. I've just been slowing down because I'm older. And then you have some sort of intervention and you realize, oh no, that was actually not age. That was something else. So to start off with, honestly, I really do suggest, if you can, to go to the Charlie Foundation website. They have a lot of really great introduction and overview on keto diet, because they're one of the few out there that I see that are not trying to sell you something. If you just kind of Google keto diet, you're going to get into a lot of pages that get into a lot of aspects of biohacking and trying to run the perfect system. And this is the perfect diet and you need to be just like this. And if you're not in keto, you're just not trying hard enough. And that may not necessarily be, it feels like it's really trying to connect in this like competitive spirit for people, which, if you're just trying to deal with some aspect of your health, maybe you don't need that competition feeling. That's one reason why I like the Charlie Foundation, for like an initiation of some aspects of it. But when it comes to talking about somebody who's perfectly healthy, this is the first part I would talk about with both perfectly healthy and people who are chronically ill. One thing you can start off with is seeing if MCT oil actually helps you. So MCT is medium chain triglycerides. So those are ones in which your body, when you get those, your body's going to use those first. It really likes those. It actually likes those almost better than carbs for being able to generate energy. And you may actually see a lot of the benefits of ketogenic ketogenic diet from generating the ketones and that energy boost just from MCT oil. Sometimes, not everybody, but it's one of those good ones to start off with. And also, so much of the really good foods for keto are based on coconut. So if you could have MCT oil, then you can have coconut. You get the benefit from that, where I don't. So that's always nice to have. But that would be usually the first part. But the other one is to really, before you would really start out with keto, is I would actually suggest try to come up with a plan. Look at what you're currently eating and what is your basic percentage of carbs and protein and fat. In order to be able to generate enough ketones to initiate ketogenesis, you would need to have a good, depending on how you're going into it, like 70 to 80% of your calories coming from fat, which is a huge amount to do. Sometimes people end up eating, they start losing a lot of weight, not necessarily from the ketogenesis, but just because the fat kind of makes them feel fuller sooner and they just don't eat as much otherwise, which is, again, another thing to watch out for. Hence the reason why planning out, especially when you're first starting keto, planning out at least a few weeks of what you would be planning on eating, and then kind of like anticipating how many carbs and that, and trying to look at the numbers of it to at least get a general ballpark. You might be somebody who likes to track individual numbers. I'm not big on individual numbers myself. I'm just not very good at being rigid that way. I'm kind of more of like, well, if I plan it out, it would be about this much of these little fat bombs that I would have. Need to do this at approximately this time of day, or And then I could have like something that might have a couple of carbs in it. I try to aim for actually less than 20 grams of carbs a day, which is pretty restrictive. Typically, most of the keto diets are like 50 grams or less. But I do best if I'm under 20 grams, which is kind of hard to stick to. But that doesn't take much. I mean, if you look at a bag of candy, you get a single piece of candy, like a Reese's little tiny one of the mini bite-sized Reese's cups, I think is like 30 grams or something like that. And so like I could have a quarter of that. And especially if you have aspects of self-control issues, when those are around, you probably shouldn't have those handy. Because it's going to be too easy to be like, well, just one won't hurt. Well, one becomes two becomes three, four, and then, then you're out of ketogenesis and you're kind of doing this like, well, I guess it just doesn't work for me. And I really dislike it when the diet doesn't work for somebody and people say, well, it's because you didn't try hard enough or you weren't following the rules of it. But that's actually one of the problems with keto is you kind of really have to. Which again is why it's so easy to trigger an eating disorder with it. So that would also be the other thing, is to watch about what kind of anxiety and stress you might have with it, about like, oh my God, am I eating too many carbs? If you're stressing about that too much, you could be easily getting into an eating disorder realm. But being able to measure your ketones, it's going to be critical, one way or the other. There's different ways you can do that. You can get urine strip tests over the counter at most pharmacies, because it is, again, for the diabetic population, they use these quite a bit in order to keep track of their ketones to avoid the ketoacidosis. So you can get those. You can get a glucometer so you can test your blood. You can get the breath meters to test the ketones you can generate from breathing. And those are good to kind of give you an idea of approximately where you're at. But the different ones, if you do the glucometer, you can do glucometer or ketometer, either one of those. Glucometer, if your glucose is very low, but you're still feeling very functional and you're not feeling hypoglycemic, there's a very good chance you're in ketosis, because that's part of how you're functioning. So that's kind of one way you can test it too, just depending on your functionality with it. But those numbers are good to keep track of, especially if you are somebody who's already dealing with a chronic health issue, because you want to make sure that you're not causing some other significant disruption and seeing like hypoglycemia kicking in. Because with hypoglycemia, if you're not actually generating ketones and you're hypoglycemic, you may not be cognitively aware about how low energy you actually are. So that's also a good one to kind of keep track of, just one way or the other, having especially that first couple of weeks when you're starting it, so you can get the feeling of what it's like to have it. And I would also say, to start it, give yourself an end date of where your trial begins or ends. So that way you have it, say you're going to try it for 4 weeks and see if you see any difference. And then try to rigidly adhere it for that particular time to see how much it makes a difference for you. And if it doesn't, this may not be the diet for you. There may be some other interventions that might need to be happening first. The biggest one is just going to be realizing how much you can't have, and then also realizing that how much fresh food you really do need. Like for me, salads are one of my main sources of foods anymore. It's just, when I say salads, there's a lot of things that can be salads. Salads is just mixing stuff together. And so it ends up being a huge part, but it's something that I enjoy. So you do have to kind of look for foods that you would actually enjoy eating. I wouldn't suggest trying to find ways to substitute something right away. So like if you think that you're like, well, I can't have regular bread, but I could have keto bread. Well, you're going to get into a whole lot of other issues. There's different if it's something like a keto bread, they're adding in other types of fiber that you may not agree with. If they're much higher in gluten, then you may not realize that you're gluten intolerant. If you're adding something, you're like, well, I could get these keto brownies. Well, they could have a lot of these other things in them that could actually be issues that would cause some part of a some thing you're reacting to, or actually may not be as keto. When you're actually purchasing like pre-made keto items, there's a lot of things in it that they may still be having more carbs, or something the label is not really necessarily always indicative of everything that's in it. So that's really, to start off with, it's really going to be whole foods from scratch if possible. So whatever the format that's going to be, and be prepared to eat more fat than you ever have before. I actually heard of one fellow that he starts off every meal like at a restaurant. If he does actually go to a restaurant, which it can be very difficult to do that, he starts off asking them for like a half a stick of butter. So that way he can then have the butter on absolutely everything. And that's the only way to make sure he keeps his ratios in line. So,
Oh, wow. How about somebody with a chronic illness that's starting off with an energy deficiency to begin with? So that catch-22 where, you're trying to do this for improvement of energy, but then you don't have the energy to, do meal prep, like you said, or, just do the tracking that's required, just stay on track with it.
So if you don't necessarily have the energy to do a lot of the prep or the tracking and that to start off with, like for myself, when I started, I did not have anything to track. And I also, when it came to the prep stuff that I did, I mostly kind of looked at a few different types of foods that I could stand to eat repetitively for 2 weeks. Because you're not going to go into a nutritional deficiency in a couple of weeks usually, unless you have something else that's much larger that you probably should address first. So to start off with, looking for some foods that are extremely high in fat, be even saturated fat, though you can actually do keto and be vegan. It is entirely possible. It's a lot harder, but you can do it. But a big part is going to be things like having like olive oil, or trying to think of different things that have a lot of fat in them that you enjoy. That's one reason why I like to suggest the Charlie Foundation website, because they talk a lot about fat bombs. And some of these are really easy to prepare. Like I will get like organic peanut butter and cream cheese and cocoa powder and mix it all together and make little balls out of it. And then it makes it, sometimes I'll just add extra, just straight butter to it too. Those are nice little, like, for one thing, it's kind of like a little bit of a candy treat. No matter what, when you're first transitioning, you're going to feel like things aren't sweet enough. And then after about a week or two in it, then if you try to have like a regular soda after that, you do this like, oh my God, this is so much sugar, I can't stand it. You realize that you kind of adjust your sweet ratio. But to start off with is to see if you do have that energy bump. It's going to be really, more than anything, it's going to just be restricting carbs that you're currently ingesting and really increasing the fat content of the food that you're eating. When you actually start calculating out the grams of fat and how much you need, you realize how much you really do. And even if you're just looking at like a bottle of olive oil and you just measure out the ounces of how much fat that would be in comparison to, okay, I wanted to eat this roll. How much fat would I have to have? Oh my God, that's like a whole cup of olive oil. I'm not ready to chug that. Then that can kind of give you this little bit of a balance, because it's not that you have zero carbs. You just have to be really strategic with what you do consume. And that's why you're trying to look for like vegetables or fruits. Like berries are great on keto. So trying to come up with different ways, like in low energy, like having like a higher fat yogurt and some berries, that can go a long ways. That's a way to have that. And then especially if you can have like a little bit of olive oil drizzled over the top, it can make it like really kind of still give you some good flavors, because that's going to be a hard part too when you're initiating a diet like this, is making sure you're having flavors that excite your mouth without having to feel like you're really in some sort of deficit. So that's the big one to start off with. But really, to be looking at fats you enjoy consuming, not trans fats, but like saturated fats, okay, the unsaturated fats and things like olive oil would be great. I mean, just looking at what you can have. Palm oil, so palm heart oil actually is also an MCT oil. So you can actually, it's medium chain triglycerides. You can have that as well. It's harder to get because they usually sell it in bulk because it's used for a lot of cooking. So you can't really, MCT oil as you get on the store is almost always coconut based. And that you can get a nice little trial bottle that works well. To get palm oil, you usually have to buy like 2 gallons at a time. And if it turns out you don't like it or it doesn't work for you, that's a big jug of oil to figure out what to do with. So it's really inexpensive though. So that's a nice thing about palm heart oil. It's actually very inexpensive. But that's the hardest part, is when you're starting off, you don't have enough energy. Tracking, while it's really helpful to start off with, it's really more than anything, it's to practice coming up with enough fat in your diet. So that's why I think that first week or two, you do need to think strategically about what fats you can actually tolerate consuming in that kind of quantity. Like when I said that person that eats like a whole thing of butter, not like just eating the butter directly, but like taking little tablespoons of the butter and putting it on everything. Could you stand to do that? Could you drizzle everything in olive oil? Could you, I mean, like not just drizzle, I mean, sometimes you kind of have to drench it. I mean, just depending on what it is. That can be hard for a lot of people at first to really consider how much they need to take in. So that's the hard part. As far as like trying to, with the lower energy amount, to actually measure and track, really the easiest one for that, I would say, would probably be the ketone urine strips, because you're probably going to urinate every day. If you're not, that's a problem. That's not going to be addressed by keto, right? And that would at least give you an idea of where you might be. So that would give you an idea if you're even within the close range, or if you've actually gone a lot higher than you thought. Because like if your ketones are actually pretty high, but you're not seeing any energy bump, this may not be as helpful for you for the amount of energy that you're putting in to restrict your diet. But then again, if you're feeling really good, but you're not generating the ketones, maybe the diet itself is helping you. You can actually generate ketones in your brain. Your brain actually can generate its own ketones. So even if it's not showing up on the glucometer or the keto meter, the blood test meter, or even with the breath meter or the urine strips, even if it's not showing up on there, that doesn't mean you're not generating ketones in your brain. You just may not be feeding the rest of your body the same way with it. So that's also one of those things too. So if you're seeing cognitive changes with it, even though you're not seeing measurable differences, it might not. So you might be going like, well, I'm not in ketogenesis, but anytime I start eating carbs, I feel like crap. Well, it may actually just be that your brain was generating ketones, but just not enough. That for your liver, if your liver's not generating enough, then that might be due to, like, again, like a viral infection that can slow down that process. So it's one of those, it's like trying to see where that balance is, because your body's going to try to save this stuff for the brain anytime it can, because the brain is energy hungry. So it'll use quite a bit. So it's hard when you're dealing with chronic illness to try to find ways to make, especially a restrictive diet like this, that's harder, that requires so much tracking to make it work for you. But once you figure out your pattern, it makes it so much easier, because you start to think of foods and recipes that you like, that you can do it. There's also like some food delivery services that can actually stay in the keto mode. Like there's a couple of the, can't think, like HelloFresh and those kind of things. Some, they actually have some that are keto based, so you could use those if you wanted to, if you had the funding for it. I don't do that because I don't live in a region that gets that very well. And then also most of them have foods that I can't have. Like I can't have mushrooms, and I can't have coconut, and I can't have garlic. And so that takes a lot of really fun foods out of the equation for me. But then those are some of those things I discovered going into keto, the keto diet, is because I tried to add those in for flavor. And my system let me know that those were very bad for me because it does not like those. That's one of the big benefits of a restrictive diet, or at least a temporary time period, is you find out what foods are going to be good for you. Because I'm big on emphasizing that there's no perfect diet for anybody. It's going to be the foods that actually make you feel better. Which ones are those? And some people, find a lot of benefit with keto. Other people don't. And in general, it's just the foods that actually make you feel better overall, and ones that I'm encouraging you to eat.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now, I know a lot of people with epilepsy, stay on the keto diet for, very long term or even lifelong. Do you think that's a good idea for everybody else outside of epilepsy to do it, in a excessively long-term years, or potentially the rest of their lives?
Oh, well, I would say there's no reason why you couldn't. It's hard to stay in that kind of restricted state, especially since so much of our social world is centered around food. Food with family, food with friends, birthday party with somebody. It ends up being very difficult at times in order to stay restrictive enough in order to stay in ketogenesis or in full ketosis and still be able to participate in those. But there are cultures throughout the world that have actually that have been in more or less a keto-based diet for like thousands of years. And so it's not that you can't do it long term. You definitely can. It's just going to be making sure that you're maintaining the appropriate nutrient levels, and that you have to be a lot more cognizant of that. about making sure you're having that. So like making sure you're having plenty of vegetables and that you're having like enough variety in your diet. If you're going to a lot of like whole fresh foods, you're going to have an easier time maintaining that, which is also, again, that's usually better for you anyway. Fresher foods, original from the source, and not as processed. That's usually a win anyway. But it's one of those, you do still want to watch for things. You want to make sure, like, you know, you start doing like regular like checkups with your doctor and things like that to make sure your cholesterol is staying in a decent state. Because there's other health conditions that can cause issues with that too. But if you start doing the keto diet and you start to see like significant negative changes in, say, your cholesterol or markers of heart health or various other things, your blood pressure starts spiking, then that's going to be something that, something needs to change. And it may be some other health condition that you're dealing with that's actually causing that issue, but definitely you want to always be prepared for the possibility that this diet may not be good for you, may work in the short term, but not necessarily long term. And you can also get a lot of the same benefits, again, from things like intermittent fasting or just like the MCT oil, but not to the same level. But you could still get some of it, even if you can't necessarily maintain it. But it becomes a logistically difficult diet to maintain long term. Because again, that it's such a restrictive diet unless you really come up with a good strategy about like how do you design your meals and your plan and the way you interact with people. Like when you have people visiting you, what kind of meal do you produce for them? If they're staying longer term, do you have other snacky foods you shouldn't have? Kind of things around. And if so, what is your plan on that? I mean, maybe it's just something where you go in and out of keto, which is kind of what I've been doing, is going in and out depending on other life circumstances, partly because in order to stay in ketosis, I have to be so very restrictive. And so sometimes I do let myself kind of get out of it. And then when I, feel a little bit more sluggish, I'll be like, all right, I'm going to stick to it harder now. But it just takes, it takes a lot of discipline to do that sometimes because it does change every aspect of your life. But if you're having such significant energy improvements like what I had, then it's worth it. But other people, the benefit may not be as sufficient to balance that out. So it's especially more difficult if you have, say, young kids at home, because they could eat it too. They can eat the keto diet. You have to watch out and make sure that they're getting, again, appropriate levels of nutrition. There's a lot of things like that. Again, definitely talking to your doctor and everything about that. That's actually one of the things the Charlie Foundation has, is they have a lot of like resources how to connect in with dietitians and nutritionists that are actually aware of keto in a bit in more of a more nuanced sense, and they can actually coordinate and work with your doctor on that. So that way they can give you like recommendations about like how to design your diet and meal plan appropriately. But that's I know I feel like I'm sponsored by Keto or by the Charlie Foundation, but they're such a good resource. It's definitely something you can do long term. Again, some people with epilepsy, this has been just more of like, this is what they do. A lot of parents with children that have like severe epilepsy may just choose the entire family to stay more in a keto-based diet. So that way you don't have that one child in the family when everybody else is eating cupcakes and they go, and you're not allowed. Especially for a child, that's a very difficult state to be in. And so it's easier for the whole family to benefit from it. But there's people who do it quite a bit long term. But it's not for everybody to do that. And I actually know a few people that what they do is they do it for a couple of months a year. And then usually the, post holidays thing in the early winter or late winter, they have to go kind of back into keto for a bit. And then as spring comes, they're having a lot more of the local spring vegetables that come out. And they're basically still kind of in keto because a lot of the spring vegetables are actually going to be ones that are lower in carb content anyway. It's usually the later summer vegetables and fruits and things that are higher in carb content. And so they can actually kind of then gradually come out of keto, and then they have the nice fall, autumn, like harvest foods, and then they get into the holidays, and then they just kind of bounce back and go more into keto again in January. So it's just kind of a individual adapting it to your life. It's not like you have to do it. Like you either do it all the way 100% for the rest of your life, or why even try? It's not that at all. It's like with any diet, any type of change in the way you do food, it's do what works for you and brings you joy. Make things that make you feel better. If it makes you feel worse, don't do it. This is generally the way it goes. I mean, there's some times in which you have to kind of push through a little bit, like especially in the beginning of something. But if long term it's not bringing you benefits, I definitely wouldn't recommend staying miserable just because, well, I got to keep my ketones up. It's like, well, if you're miserable, like I myself, if my ketones get over like I know some people, they feel absolutely amazing when their ketones are really high. But myself, if I get over 2.0, I feel like it's extreme. I'm feeling mood dip. I just start feeling cranky. And I just get this like, well, why try anything? Never. And I'm like, oh, look, my ketones are really high. Oh, well, it's ketones. I start getting just like, it doesn't necessarily help me to maintain a very high level of ketones, especially with the amount of work and restriction that has to do in order to get to that point. So it's kind of going to be get really independent, really individual about what works for you. But yeah, you can do it long term. Like I've been doing it for 4-ish years now. So yeah, it's been working reasonably well for me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Richelle. This has been incredibly informative. Can you tell people where they can find you and follow you?
If you wanted to, you can follow me on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it now. You can find me there if you want. My handle's @ReallyRichelle. If you look for me, so Richelle Sepulveda. Also, the easiest way to find me is RichelleSepulveda.com. And then I also, if you really want to find me, Isabel has my information. She knows where I am on Renegade Research and things like that. So, if you desperately want to, you need to interact with me personally. It's like, yeah, she can hook you up. But yeah, that's like, I have a few things. I actually have a few things like my experience with keto and things like that. I do have that a bit on my website, RichelleSepulveda.com. So that's nice and easy. I figured people kept asking me questions, so I thought, I'll just make a quick little website and then let's put it on there. And then, so, because otherwise
your website is really informative for a variety of reasons. So I really recommend people go there. You can have some very interesting hypotheses and, again, a lot of great information. So this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing your experience and your knowledge with our listeners. Thank you so much, Richelle. And
thank you, Isabel. Yeah. Thank you for having me. It was fun. I like to share knowledge. That's the thing I like to do. It's like somebody says, do you want to share this little bit of knowledge? And I'll be like, do I? Yes, I do.
Wonderful. That's what we all need. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Ancestral Health Today. We hope you enjoyed our discussion on how evolutionary insights can inform modern health practices. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast to catch future episodes.